Frank Cody to give the Colloquium talk this afternoon. Frank Cody is an anthropologist at the University of Toronto and a dear friend from my own university days. Frank's published a book called The Light of Knowledge, which is a study of literacy activism and political mobilization in Tamil Nadu. His current interests, I suppose, flow from those interests, but onto newer directions. The talk is called Between the Law and the Street, Political Publicity in Tamil News Media. Frank.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to share some work with you today. It's especially a great time to do this because I'm in the middle of field work. I just came from Chennai. The elections are coming up, and it's an interesting time to be studying news there. So I look forward to questions and sort of feedback on how I might conceptualize this a little more sharply. The specter of political publicity continues to haunt the age of the post-public sphere. Just as every surface of our social world is increasingly subject to recording and possible mass dissemination, whether through CCTV or cell phone, so do political images seem to proliferate endlessly. And one of the things that first sort of caught my attention was the degree to which political images, especially with the rise of Photoshop technology and the proliferation of computers in sort of working class and rural areas, is that even now in life course events like puberty rituals or ear piercings, wedding invitations, people find it necessary to have a political figure on their invitation cards. And I found that kind of a striking change that happened relatively quickly in Tamil Nadu. It would seem that intangible concepts of power like that of popular sovereignty require the sensuous form of the political image in the widest sense of the term. Be it seen, this is Modi with Ambedkar floating right above him. Read, of course, Jayalalitha. Heard, this is Vijay Kant, who's now projecting himself as the third front chief ministerial candidate. Or indeed touched. This is a temple to MGR that was erected in Madurai near the Tepakulam area. Now, one of the things that's very striking is, of course, during the election period, you have to cover all these images up. They're all painted over. And even, this is Amma Unavakam, which is the very cheap food stands that were brought in with this government, the ADMK government. And even there, her face has been covered. It's almost as if at the very instant where the sort of these images were covered, the sort of power that flows through them was transformed into money that's now coursing through the state of Tamil Nadu in the form of cash handouts that's going to potential voters. To the degree that we're invested in the ideal of popular sovereignty, we can't appear to do without tangible images of political publicity, even as it becomes impossible to assume the figure of a coherent public to which such images would correspond to. So what are we to make of this form, born of an age of mass politics that strikes many now as obsolescent? Varied manifestations of the people, Janta, Makkar in Tamil, remain strong, along with the sense that multiple publics collide with each other in increasingly unpredictable and potentially explosive ways. Even the ideology of liberal democracy that grounded so much theory on the public sphere appears strained before the onslaught of neoliberal globalization and the escalation of a new image politics that certainly stinks of fascism. And I'm thinking here not only of India, but of contemporary politics in the United States. There is, of course, a long tradition of lamenting the decline of the public that dates back to at least Hannah Arendt and Jürgen Habermas, and probably before. I'd like to note that my use of ghostly imagery here is not meant to get us into the question of whether or not there was a truly living public in a robust sense of the term. It's clear enough that tangible images of political power were a problem for liberalism all along, insofar as such models in place and embody certain figures of personhood as grounds upon which to project a zero-degree subject that sits at the normative core of liberal theory. We're familiar from colonial Orientalism with this maneuver in the figure of the excitable native who can't transcend worlds of kin, caste, religion, and community, and so cannot be trusted to inhabit the world of dispassionate rationality, a classic colonial reasoning. Scholars like Nancy Fraser and Michael Warner have demonstrated how the forms of unmarked self-abstraction that characterize liberal ideologies of publicity rely on the production of and differentiation from excessively embodied others marked also by gender and sexuality. But when thinking through Indian or American democratic practice, one cannot help but be struck by the degree to which the authors I've mentioned adhere to the very subject of negative individual liberty they provide an imminent critique of. So what I'd like to do is extend the critical apparatus to begin to ask a series of questions about the grounds upon which we might develop understandings of political publicity that are more collectively oriented and that rely on modes of figuring the dialectic of political representation and substantive participation, in other words, the narrowly political and the more broadly aesthetic, other than through the opposition between self-abstraction and embodiment that has been dominant in liberal discourse. So, what would critical theories of publicity and its relation to popular sovereignty that need not assume the hegemony of liberalism look like? My attempt to address these large questions rests on a study of Tamil news media. While the larger research this talk is a part of will take me back to the rise of mass media and mass politics in Tamil Nadu in the 1940s and 1950s, today I'll concentrate on recent trends and events to begin the work of developing an understanding of the political image and its limits in the contemporary age. My focus is on the newspaper, that organ of public opinion that many have taken to be foundational to the rise of both nationalism and the public sphere, and which remains quite potent as a flashpoint and struggles to define the political image of leaders today, even as it is increasingly blending from printed paper into the digital domain. Many of you might know, despite or perhaps because of the rapid spread of satellite television and other digital media, newspapers in India remain a vital and profitable news-producing institution. In Tamil Nadu, the major newspapers have historically taken on the added value of being less closely tied to one of the two major political parties in the state than television, which until very recently was ruled by party-owned channels. The advent of new television channels, Tandi TV, which is owned by the largest newspaper, and Pudiya Talamure, which is owned by a completely marginal political party, have made news much more interesting in this medium. The satellite news scene has changed very rapidly recently. I'll also be looking at biweekly political sort of gossip week publications, which have played a particularly significant role in shaping political discourse in the region. Under the broad conceptual umbrella of delineating the logic of political publicity in the press, I'll narrow the inquiry to what I take to be two important modes through which the contours of what can be published are worked out. The first is the law, in cases of defamation in particular. The second is the street, where violence routinely erupts in connection with political news reporting. I hope to show that there are continuities in the logics of representation and publicity that cut across both domains, having to do with the sacredness, at times spectral, of political bodies that are at the same time commodity images. One important commonality has to do with the fact that both practices, legal attack and physical attack, which may be seen as instruments of repression, are often turned into the stuff of publicity itself through the alchemy of news production, fueling the very fires they were meant to smother through further remediation. I'll further argue that the political images I'm studying here are in fact spectral in several senses, having to do in part with their imbrication in processes through which commodities are mediated for mass consumption. This is the sort of Marxian approach to fetishism, where a whole set of social relations condense in the body of the leader, but more specifically because they rely on structures of devotion, charisma, and sovereignty that are tied to an age of centralized mass media production that is now quickly passing. One cannot help but feel that the nexus between celluloid film and Dravidian or Tamil nationalist ideology that played such a potent role in fueling the image politics of Tamil Nadu is losing some of its binding power, at least in the field of parliamentary elections. Just look at the current crop of current chief ministerial candidates and look at their ages and sort of the sense of vitality that surrounds their politics. We're waiting to see the face of democracy to come in a place where every single major political leader since the late 1960s has come from the world of film, a world that itself is being overturned. We've seen the shift from single-screen theaters and mass stars in the linguistic regions to a multiplex and digitally circulated world of images that can rapidly catalyze mass affect, but cease to have the staying power required to build the political superstar that has long fueled Tamil politics. At the level of news media, there's been a similar fragmentation and intensification of space-times of publicity as we move from one crisis or scandal to the other in a sort of amnesiac daze. Now, I realize this is all pretty abstract and perhaps somewhat foreign in light of its regional specificity, so I'd like to turn now to some concrete examples to help develop a framework that I hope can speak beyond the region as well. I'll first talk about the law, and that'll be the main part of this paper, and then I'll talk a little bit about political violence and how that gets taken up in media. On the evening of 20th June 2014, an 11-story building still under construction collapsed in the Chennai suburb of Malivakkam. 61 people died as a result, the vast majority of them construction workers from across southern and eastern India. The following morning, on Sunday, newspaper and satellite television headlines were full of details, both heroic and also horrific, about efforts to rescue those who were trapped under the rubble. It was on Monday morning that sharper questions started to arise about the causes of the collapse. On that day, the Tamil daily, Dinamalar, ran with its typical one-word headline. Avalam, tragedy. This is a newspaper that every single day has a one-word headline followed by an exclamation point. But this was followed by two more accusatory subheadlines introducing a front-page story. The first noting that two different government orders had been issued to ease normal safety regulations for the building, and the second reporting that the Chief Minister, J. Jayalalitha, said that the government planning agency responsible for approving and monitoring such constructions, the Chennai Metropolitan Development Authority, had done nothing wrong. The article Dinamalar had printed used specific evidence obtained from government reports to indicate that officials from the CMDA must have known about and excused infractions in the building process. When talking to reporters and editors at the newspaper later that week, I learned that they had obtained a leaked email where they gleaned the details that gave the article its heavy evidentiary weight from within the Secretariat. Now, nearly everyone suspects large-scale corruption in the construction industry, but discussing this among friends is very different from printing incriminating evidence that points back to the state's involvement in one of Tamil Nadu's most widely read daily newspapers, and in fact the most widely read Tamil website in the world. The following day, the Chennai public prosecutor filed a complaint of defamation, citing Section 499 of the Indian Penal Code before the Principal Sessions Court on behalf of the Chief Minister, accusing the paper of malicious intention to harm the reputation of the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. Now, the Chief Minister's office in Tamil Nadu often uses criminal defamation suits to restrict the domain of the publishable. But such a direct confrontation with Jayalalitha was somewhat unusual for Dinamalar at the time. The paper had long supported her party, the ADMK, from the days when party founder and superstar actor M.G. Ramachandran, or MGR, fought with the DMK to form his own party. Indeed, Dinamalar and Jayalalitha shared a common enemy in the person of Mu Karunanidhi, who had once shut off electrical power to the newspaper in retaliation for a negative article they had written in the 1970s, and who started the practice, now very common, of withdrawing government advertisements from newspapers that criticized the government in power. But relations had already soured before the Malivakkam report, and this scoop was also too good to give up. While many accusations of defamation are never noted in the newspaper that finds itself in the position of defendant, this time Dinamalar took a different route. They published a front-page article the day after the case had been filed about the filing of the case itself, with a big headline, providing in a single text a great deal of publicity for themselves as leaders of critical journalism, and also criminal, I suppose, through their defense of the original story about Malivakkam and a refutation, line by line, of the charges of defamation. So in this case, we see a simple instance of how censorship as a potential block to publicity becomes the very stuff of publicity itself. Censorship becomes a news item. We might term this the absorptive capacity of news media, as it intermediates a legal system that asserts control over news media while also providing it with much of its content. By pointing to intermediation, I take the law as a media system of sorts as well, one that can also absorb attempts by the press to keep advocates and judges in line through public scrutiny. Apart from attempts to block the flow of information, we're also familiar with cases of judges actively using the media as a stage for social commentary when giving judgments. This happens all too often, and I think it's actually encouraged by the sort of proliferation of digital media, which is really interested in sound bites coming out of judges' mouths. In each media system, law and news plays a role in normalizing the other as a distinct domain while periodically staging events of interpenetration. These are often framed as breaches of the norm that's otherwise been achieved. Censorship, I think, is an interesting entry point into this dynamic of eventing and normalizing, not only in dramatic cases of defamation or sedition, which is something that's, we've heard a lot about in Delhi recently, but is also very commonly used elsewhere, but also in more mundane invocations of contempt of court that are used to control news coverage in ways that rarely provoke comment in the news media itself. So very often the ways in which the law is used to shut down the media doesn't sort of get taken up in news media. But when a publisher does decide to make a news event out of such an intervention, the results are very unpredictable. Accusations of defamation are not only means of silencing the press, although they are that too. Such a display of power through the law is itself a gamble on publicity, to borrow a phrase from Mozzarella and Kaur. All of the parties involved have a sense of the stakes, but none knows the outcome ahead of time. What legal historians have seen as problems of amplification or magnification, this is where the accusation of defamation leads to greater scrutiny of the faults attributed to the plaintiff and greater renown for the defendant, appear to be old ones. We have plenty of cases from the 19th century. But something somewhat different is happening in more recent times, I think, such that amplification and magnification, processes that were foundational to the rise of critical publicity in the press since the early 19th century, have turned into a feedback loop of sorts. They're not side effects of critical journalism, but desperately sought after ends in themselves, fueling print capitalism. Many in the press reflexively court defamation cases and other legal reprisals in search of publicity, as means of putting both their journal and their political target in the spotlight. Without indulging in undue nostalgia for an age of idealist journalism, which many journalists do, we may nevertheless note that in a world where the critical function of news publicity bleeds almost seamlessly into its commodity value, the kind of secrets that are unveiled in the name of public scrutiny of government authority are often of the very same quality as those that are at the heart of the culture industry. Both share in the logic of commodity imagery, public personality, and celebrity reputation. This melding of critique and commodification takes on a gigantic quality in a place like Tamil Nadu, where many of the characters involved are in fact celebrities, their entry into formal parliamentary politics marking a cine-political event in the terminology of Madhav Prasad, to which we'll return. So to the degree that the genre distinctions between political leaders and film celebrities have been completely blurred for decades in Tamil Nadu, I think that a study of the logics of political publicity in the state has much to tell us about more recent trends elsewhere. So first, let's get a little clarity on the legal media involved and a little history on the use of these laws. As with other aspects of tort law in colonial context, defamation was criminalized in the Indian Penal Code drafted in 1860. It exists today as both a criminal and a civil offense. The Supreme Court, and some of you might have followed this, was holding hearings last July and August on whether Article 499 of the IPC should be retained in light of its pervasive use as a political weapon. They seem inclined to keep it. Perhaps progressive lawyers hope they're able to read it down to limit its application. Other charges that are used in a similar fashion are breach of privilege, which I'll talk about a little bit, and sedition, which we've seen a lot of recently. What marks independent India's difference, of course, is Article 19.1, subclause A of the Constitution, which gives the right to free speech. But as scholars like Lawrence Liang and more recently Gautam Bhatia in his new book note, this was immediately curtailed by the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution, to subclause B, which goes on to allow, quote, any law relating to libel, slander, defamation, contempt of court, or any matter that offends against decency or morality, or which undermines the security of the state or tends to overthrow the state. So these are all the laws that are allowed in order to restrict the original freedom of speech. This was eventually further amended with the word reasonable before the restrictions, in addition to language about friendly relations with foreign states, and finally the addition of public order as something that could be invoked to limit free speech. Note, sedition is not in that list, and that was a big fight during the constitutional debates. In conjunction with the original subclause and amendments, the other protection that comes into play is to restrict freedom of expression is Article 21, the protection of life and personal liberty, which is alleged to have been violated when accusations of defamation are made. The archive tells us that after the original Press Objectionable Matters Act was taken off the national books in 1956, it was K. Kamaraj's Congress that passed a new state-level press act in 1960, which made scurrilous or grossly indecent writings intended for blackmail punishable with imprisonment or fine. I've been looking and I've so far found few, if any, political uses of this law that has since lapsed. According to senior journalists I've talked to, the practice of policing the press through criminal defamation was in fact initiated by Karunanidhi, especially during his second tenure as chief minister beginning in 1971. During the emergency, of course, few defied national censorship. In Chennai, the exceptions were the Indian Express, which was Chennai-based, and the Tamil Daily that it owns, Dinamani, and Cho Ramaswamy's satirical weekly Tughlaq. MGR, when he was Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, extended the emergency logic through another anti-scurrilous writing ordinance in 1981, widely used against dissent. It was originally issued as a government order against the critical DMK evening paper called Yedroli, and eventually became a law passed by the Assembly, rather. The evening paper, Yedroli, had carried a report on the then health minister accepting a Premier Padmini car in exchange for allotting a medical college seat. And its editor, Argad Vidasamy, was sent to 20 days for this reporting. This was a time when corruption was much simpler than it is today. Like a similar defamation law that Rajiv Gandhi later tried to bring to the central legal framework, this law made defamation a cognizable and non-bailable offense, like sedition, such that police could arrest and jail a suspect without a court warrant. It was repealed in 1984 after a series of protests led mainly by the DMK. When it comes to the use of defamation as a means of controlling news media, however, every senior journalist I've interviewed agrees that it was during Jayalalitha's first tenure as chief minister that a new level of combat between the state and the press became the norm. Between 1991 and 1993, 180 criminal defamation cases were filed against journalists and political leaders. She withdrew all of December 30th, 1993, in a dramatic act of sovereignty premised on the exhibition value of official pardon. But the political use of such defamation cases continues to this day with a lot of regularity. The current government had filed around 190 cases, last time I checked, of criminal defamation against media and political leaders, more than any other state in India. Such that recently the Supreme Court stepped in November to advise the government of Tamil Nadu to stop taking criticism of governance as a personal insult. Recently, for example, the public prosecutor filed a criminal case against the Times of India, the Chennai edition, for merely reporting on the number of road accidents in the state, accusing them of being defamatory against the chief minister as a errant person. Here the chief minister is recapitulating earlier efforts on the part of her mentor, MGR. Here's MGR in his film regalia on her way to MGR used to ensure that stories about school children getting sick by eating food provided by his midday meal scheme were quashed through his harsher state-level defamation law. Now, both cases follow some of the logic of branding, and we'll get into Jayalalitha and brand a little bit. Insofar as the publication of a fault with the product of government care here reflects back on the more intangible properties of the sign that would stand as the very essence of care for the poor, namely the persons of MGR and Jayalalitha respectively. So this is where personal reputation and government work bleed into one another. Jayalalitha, like MGR before her, and other political leaders that came from the film world, inhabits a domain of personal sovereignty that does exceed her office of chief minister, or the very parliamentary state structure that lend this office authority as an office. Negative reports on issues of law and order and development appear to be important triggers for defamation cases, but they're not the only ones, and I would even say they are a minority at this point. A great many cases of alleged defamation are more directly concerned with the very person of the chief minister, and turn on the accusation of untrue and, more importantly, from a legal perspective, maliciously motivated. The language of malicious motivation actually comes from a U.S. Supreme Court precedent. Depictions of that person as known through tangible images of personhood, not only through their good works. And part of my argument is that it's the medium of the law itself that serves in a substantial fashion to blur these lines, or in fact subsume the state office within the larger question of political leadership. And it's here that we can return to the dynamic of amplification turned into feedback that I described a moment ago, insofar as print capitalism thrives on uncovering the veiled faults of celebrity political leaders, focusing in particular on their bodies. Now, the integration of political critical journalism and celebrity expose is very obvious in Tamil weekly and bi-weekly political journals. But I'd like to begin with an example from a paper that is generally very cautious and even docile when reporting on the state government. The Chennai-based English daily, The Hindu, India's paper of record, was not only accused of defamation many times by Jayalalitha, but also charged with a much more serious offense of breach of legislative privilege in 2003, along with S. Selvam, editor of the Tamil language DMK party mouthpiece daily paper Murasoli. Responding to a critical editorial entitled Rising Intolerance, which the paper knew would lead to some trouble, the Legislative Assembly charged The Hindu with breach of the right of a member of legislature to speak freely in the House without fear of being sued for slander. Now note here, paradoxically, a legal protection against defamation becomes the grounds upon which to accuse the press of libel. And this is an interesting place where sort of protection, a legal protection becomes a legal medium of threat. As a result of the motion passed by the Assembly's Privileges Committee on November 7th, within half an hour, the Chennai police descended on the houses of publishers and editors in an attempt to arrest them and send them to jail for 15 days, because this too is a non-bailable offense. Turns out the whole editorial staff had been warned ahead of time that this was coming, and they had skipped town for Bangalore. They were being housed, in fact, the lore in the journalistic world is they were being housed in S.M. Krishna's house. But N. Ram, editor-in-chief, was back at the office in Chennai that night when the police came twice, the second time surrounded by cameras and microphones of local media. The front page of the following day's newspaper was quite dramatic indeed. Apart from the powerful photograph of Ram sitting at his desk, confronting the police, the paper responded with a resounding criticism of the abuse of legislative privilege in a stinging front-page editorial. Here, as had happened before, the Chief Minister's gamble with publicity produced by the attempt to censor the paper appears to have backfired at a certain level of representation. That is, among readers of the Hindu paper, which are actually a very small minority of people in any city. But of course, this would have been seen as a show of power by her supporters. By November 10th, the Supreme Court had stayed the arrest of all the accused, and the Chief Minister's reputation for excessive use of force to silence her critics only grew among the sort of more liberal end of the English-speaking public. Now, S. Selvam, editor of Murasoli, was in fact arrested for simply reprinting in Tamil what the Hindu had published in English, crossing the linguistic divide, and that was actually perhaps more dangerous than publishing this thing in English. Once you publish this thing in Tamil, it becomes very dangerous. Now, it's a different matter that the Hindu, unlike Murasoli, slipped back into an amicable relationship with the Chief Minister when she returned to power in 2011, and there are some interesting reasons behind that. Although it does speak to the different temporalities at play in the relationship between spectacular breaches and everyday threats. For the moment, I'd like to dwell briefly on the words that were used in the offending editorial that led to the accusation of breach of privilege. It appears that the Privileges Committee was disturbed in particular by how the Hindu had been reporting speeches given by the Chief Minister in the Assembly. The paper characterized her speeches as unrestrained, fuming diatribes delivered in a high-pitched voice. It was the tight focus on her uncontrolled bodily demeanor, and in this case her voice, that appeared to have provoked retaliation. In its response to the motion of breach of privilege, the Hindu's editorial expresses surprise that a mere list of unpleasant verbs and adjectives describing the Chief Minister's bodily demeanor should be taken as offensive, as opposed to what the paper saw as the much more serious and, in their words, well-reasoned arguments against her politics. I think that this focus on the political body is significant, especially in light of the gender politics at play, where the news media treat women who occupy the space of publicity with general aggression. Indeed, the Chief Minister's adoption of the fictive kin identity of Amma may be seen partly as a move to counter the otherwise negatively sexualized aura of feminine publicity. As we shift to look at papers more deeply invested in fueling the feedback loop of expose and legal condemnation around the unauthorized circulation of the political body, verbal and pictorial, we can see a wider field of contestation emerge. And here we can see through the use of this law that sober English dailies like The Hindu and more wild Tamil political magazines can inhabit different positions within the same domain that has been opened by the use of defamation law. Turning now to explicit investments in the cycle of arrest, legal intervention, and publicity, and what this means for the body as a commodity image, I want to note that journalists are almost never arrested. All the persistent force of defamation charges rides more on the indignity of journalists who produced before the Chennai Sessions Court, waiting in long hours with their fellow criminally accused, more than it does on fear of incarceration or even the money involved in fighting such a case. Now, when people fight a civil defamation suit, the costs are staggering, but these politically motivated ones tend to be criminal defamation suits. And we can get into some of the legal reasons for that. And even in a civil suit, which Jayalalitha has a few against the press, people who sort of engage in this form of publicity see this as a form of advertising costs, essentially. That you know it's going to cost so much money, so many hours in court, but it's worth it because it generates this sort of excitement around your journal. So in order to fully understand the nature of these image wars and the role of defamation in these wars, I'd like to turn to the whole career of Nakiran Gopal, known from journalism. Now, he's politically aligned with the DMK. R. Gopal began as a layout artist for the Tamil gossip weekly named Tarasi in the mid-1980s. And it was from there that he decided to start his own bi-weekly journal named Nakiran in 1988. It's named after the medieval poet who is said to have had confrontations with Lord Shiva himself. The new bi-weekly followed in Tarasi's wake and eventually overtook it, publishing about violent criminality with connections to the state, exposing corruption and other official misdeeds. In Gopal's telling of the story, they had no phone in it. We had to arrange it with a nearby tea shop, and we'd pay a certain amount for every phone call we received, and a boy would collect the messages from the tea shop and convey it to us every hour, he says. The image of the tea shop with political debates of the day are flashed out in a semi-public, uncensored, and deeply masculine domain is important here. It's the tea shop ethos that Gopal brought into the printed pages of his magazine. So this is the cover of Tarasa where he used to work and kind of provided a model for a whole genre of political magazines that came out of it. The list of Gopal's tussles with the law is very long and very colorful. Many of his stories were meant to provoke such publicity through sales-generating friction with authority. He first rose to prominence when he tried and eventually published parts of the autobiography of a serial killer, Aro Shankar, who also implicated a number of police officials and other government officials of corruption. The government of Tamil Nadu tried to invoke a pre-censorship, that is to say, to stop him from publishing this autobiography, and this eventually made its way to the Supreme Court and still stands as one of the important precedents in free speech law in India, based on the principle that you can't pre-censor things. Defamation is something you can accuse something after the fact, and it's not something you can sort of anticipate through legal means. It's with Gopal's relationship with the forest brigand and sandalwood smuggler, who you're familiar with here in Karnataka, Veerappan, that the magazine shot to national fame. Following a fascination from his days at Tarasa, Gopal had developed a close relationship with Veerappan, who was wanted for a number of murders, eventually for kidnapping Kannadiga superstar Rajkumar, among others, to run a series of interviews with Nakiran, contributing to the bandit's image as a Robin Hood type figure. And at the same time, he would publish pictures of Nakiran reading about himself, Veerappan reading about himself in Nakiran, producing this interesting form of meta-publicity. Gopal was arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act in 2003 as a result of this reporting and served 253 days in prison before finally being acquitted in 2009. It's during this time that the battle between Nakiran and Jayalalitha took on epic proportions in a series of articles that culminated in a civil claim for 2 crores and 1,000 in damages and a court injunction against Nakiran publishing any inflammatory material about Jayalalitha and her close friend Sasikala without their prior approval. So actually, they managed to get some form of prior restraint that was eventually shot down in the Madras High Court, citing the case he had won in the Supreme Court in 1994. In a recent interview, Nakiran Gopal boasts that he's currently fighting 211 cases in various courts, including 15 cases filed by the current Tamil Nadu regime and others by private parties. There are also 260 FIRs that are still being investigated against him, and his journal has spent about 4 crore between 2001 and 2010 on legal battles. This is something he brags about. If you look at the articles cited in the Madras court cases against Gopal, you can see once again the degree to which the stuff of offense is focused on the plaintiff's body. and not only on her government's political stances per se. For example, the only passage from an article that's explicitly quoted in the injunction case, and which is wrapped into the civil defamation suit, compares the lack of alliances between the chief minister's party and the willingness of several illnesses to make themselves at home in her body, and goes on to make claims about huge numbers of medicines she has to take, even claims that her companion Sasikala is plying her with, quote, certain other things. This was interpreted by the advocate representing the plaintiffs as a reference to alcohol. Other people interpreted as painkillers. He eventually won the appeal against the injunction, but not the whole civil case, which is still looming over his head. More recently, in August last year, the magazine was charged with criminal defamation for printing rumors that were spreading wildly on WhatsApp and other social media at the time of the chief minister's ill health, once again, suggesting that she might at any moment be taken to Singapore or to Johns Hopkins Hospital in the United States for treatment of a large number of illnesses. Now, the question of genre and modes of circulation here is important. I think the fact that now a journal like this actually quotes WhatsApp is interesting, because this sort of rumor form has a tradition that actually dates back to Terasa and other political journals like this, and it's an important genre in Tamil political journalism that now can actually cite sources like WhatsApp. They also cited Tahelko. The section was called Dialysis Garden Report, which is a terrible pun on her home neighborhood of Poise Garden. It was written in rumor format, attributing the source of all this to social media and what people were talking about on the street, using the quotative uncertain "it seems." This article, which, quote, impeaches the reputation of the chief minister in the words of the petition filed, was printed at a time when Jayalalitha had not been seen in public for 10 days, just after having been re-elected in the by-election after her arrest, and after failing to show up for a number of scheduled events. So it was actually plausible sounding to a lot of readers. Chennai was rife with talk that she had indeed left the country to seek treatment for one or some of her many problems. So what are we to make with this fixation on the body and its capacity to provoke legal action in the form of defamation cases, even when conviction is nearly impossible? What's the relationship between the political image and governance? And how do we see this reporting within the larger context of standard political reporting, while also taking into account the kind of bodies that are subject to this type of scrutiny? As more astute readers would have noted, the 92-year-old wheelchair-bound Karunanidhi, who was among the leading voices demanding that the chief minister reveal the details of her health, never seemed to attract the same kind of attention. Now, there are political, legal, and technological logics that explain why this particular constellation emerged. Here I'll discuss the legal and political, and then we'll get to technology toward the end of the talk. In the cases above, the allegation is made that the newspaper published with malicious intention to damage the reputation of the chief minister. And as I noted, the language of malice actually comes from a United States Supreme Court ruling, Sullivan versus the New York Times, which is this kind of the gold standard of free speech rulings in the judicial world. It's already complicated because the chief minister is, of course, both an office and a person, things we like to think of as conceptually separable, and in the law it's very important to separate them, but it's very difficult to do so in terms of how they work politically. Now, the law is actually ambiguous on the question of public servants. On the one hand, it maintains the press's right to scrutinize public officials in the second exception to the law of criminal defamation, section 499 of the IPC, which says, it is not defamation to express in good faith any opinion whatsoever respecting the conduct of a public servant in the discharge of his public functions, respecting his character, so far as his character appears in that conduct and no further, end quote. So that's what gives you extra leeway to publish about public figures. But this protection is counterbalanced by section 199(2) of the Code of Criminal Procedure, which was written up in 1973, which makes breach of any criminal law a cognizable offense before the Court of Session upon complaint in writing made by the public prosecutor if the person involved is a public servant of high office. So you can drag anyone into court if the public prosecutor thinks you might have said anything about a public figure. So in that case, the standard for public figures is much lower. And the public prosecutor is, of course, assigned by the chief ministers. So he has an interest in protecting her reputation, as it were. A sort of right to publicity that is similar to that enjoyed by film stars in the US, but not in India, here extends to political leaders. And I think they're sort of invoking this type of right to publicity through other means in some ways, using these laws. but not enough to haul someone up on charges. There's an essential legal contradiction that allows so many cases to be filed, posing a threat without convictions. Okay, now the political logic. Far from the political body that is transparently at one with the state that we associate with totalitarian regimes, especially in a famous essay by Claude Lefort, what we can see here is a body in which the aspirations of a people might indeed condense, but one that has a great deal of independence from the state as a widely circulating commodity image. This is the, quote, shadow structure of political representation and extra-parliamentary authority, or so-called phantom sovereignty, that theorists of South Indian film like S.V. Srinivas, Madhaprasad, or Rajan Kurai Krishnan have written about with regards to cinepolitical leaders, and is not reducible by any means to the office of the chief minister, or to the sovereign as the mere executor of state law. The value of the leader, like the cinema star, is an intangible essence that breathes life into particular material products, the most obvious being welfare schemes targeting particular populations. It's here where the image touches ground, as it were, taking material form that is both powerful but also vulnerable. The image of the chief minister indeed operates like a commercial brand, which has also been defined, like the legal definition of reputation, as a, quote, intangible asset. Here, unacceptable citation of the tangible brand image causes damage to this intangible asset. In the case of the current chief minister, she was, of course, a brand before entering into politics, and her brandedness has been cultivated further, although its qualities have certainly changed with the shift towards what PR firms called brand amma, which is now, of course, a registered trademark associated with a range of concrete commodities, including cement, pharmaceuticals, and water. Like the unauthorized use of the material sign pointing back to a trademark product, depictions of the political body that fall out of bounds are subject to legal sanction as an attack on reputation. I think the weapon of defamation, one that can be turned back in a judo-like fashion on those who wield it, should be interpreted in light of this particular populist logic of political reputation, but it's a thoroughly commodified populism, and I think that's what's missing in some of the more sophisticated accounts of political populism that we have in political theory literature. In response to the political body's illicit exposure and citation in news media, it's the journalist body that stands exposed before the court that will not convict it of any wrongdoing. But even this can be turned around. For example, recently Karunanidhi decided to appear himself and produce his frail, aging body before the court in his wheelchair, when he was excused from doing so by the judge in order to make a point about abuse of defamation and to produce positive publicity for his DMK party, which is lagging as opposition in this election year. Okay, so now I want to turn from the law to the street, because the law is not the only medium through which these battles are fought. I'll turn to look much more briefly at more physical means of making tangible the otherwise phantasmagoric political image of popular sovereignty in Tamil Nadu. Like in other parts of India and elsewhere in the world, journalists face a great deal of violence, most often from people that they know quite well, usually police. What seems to be happening quite often, and I think more these days than in the past, at least in Tamil Nadu, are attacks by crowds of people in the very offices that house journalistic production. These attacks are expressly symbolic forms of protest, intended as expressions of discontent and threats against further publication along particular lines. Like defamation suits, such attacks not only limit the domain of the publisher, they become important content of publicity through the absorptive capacities of news media. But unlike defamation suits, to pursue political ends, crowd violence has none of the ethical legitimacy that the law in the abstract normally enjoys. We tend to think of these defamation suits as misuses of the law. It's not the law itself that's the problem. But we tend to think of people in sort of crowds or in mob-like behavior as more immediate or spontaneous, deriving from raw emotions at one end of the explanatory spectrum, or as purely instrumental, calculated displays of brute force on the part of political leaders at the other end of the spectrum. Because interpretations of political violence or displays of mass affect more broadly tend to fall in one of these two categories, either raw and mediated passion, and this is often in Tamil Nadu usually attributed to the very cultural nature of the Tamil people, or what's often called self-serving sycophancy, an insincere display meant to further the ends of political power. Some of us remember the image of Paneerselvam when he became chief minister crying his way into office, a rather unusual thing to do. But I think if we pay too much attention to this, we fail to understand the logic that's particular to the political performativity of bodies on the street in the contemporary media age. So I don't want to get into the task of proving the sincerity of sentiment, leading some to go so far as to take their own lives as an act of political devotion, or the opposite, an equally limited one of showing that those who participate in public displays of anger do so because of external imposition, whatever that means. I think we can shift the terms of argumentation without apologizing for this form of violence, which is quite horrendous. I mean, people die. I'd like to bring the news producers into the picture, not only as innocent victims, but to examine some of the forms of performative agency that they also wield on such occasions. So I'd like to do that by sharing 3 events to explore questions about how we might think differently about the capacity of print capitalism to condition crowd actions and vice versa, and what are the forms of mutual recognition involved. On May of 2007, the paper Dinakaran printed the results of a survey they conducted in association with the Nielsen Corporation, asking who is the likely heir to replace Chief Minister of the state at the time, Karunanidhi, as head of the DMK party, when he was no longer able to lead. The poll was titled Makkal Manasu, the people's hearts or the people's minds, indicating that it's not simply an objective question about likely succession, but actually a question about who would you support in such a case of succession. Now, at the time, Karunanidhi was 82 years old, and it was assumed by all that one of his sons would take over the party leadership. The paper Dinakaran, which was a DMK paper, published the results of their poll, showing that the younger M.K. Stalin, former mayor of Chennai, leading in public opinion by a large margin, with 70% of respondents indicating that he would be the next party leader. This did not go down well with his brother Alagiri, who's based in the southern city of Madurai and widely known more for his dealings in pirate videos and violent crime than for his political acumen. He only received 2% support. On the day the poll was published, a group of protesters led by the mayor of Madurai began a series of street protests, burning copies of the newspaper and blocking traffic in front of the Dinakaran newspaper office. Some had begun to throw stones at the office when a group of Alagiri loyalists, led by the infamous muscle man and gangster Attack Pandi, pulled up in a Toyota Qualis. They attacked the office with stones, metal, and eventually petroleum bombs. The office exploded into raging fire, killing 2 computer engineers and 1 security guard. The journalists had escaped. By all accounts, the Madurai police simply stood by watching while the violence was unfolding. This attack was to have much wider significance, illustrating what Stanley Tambaya terms the transvaluation of a relatively local event as it gets taken up in the national media ecology. Now, in order to understand all the stakes involved, it's important to know that Dinakaran had recently been purchased by Kalanidhi Maran, owner of the Sun Media Network, at the time Asia's most profitable media company. The paper was being rebranded even though it retained its old name. Now, Kalanidhi Maran is, of course, also the great nephew of Karunanidhi himself, as well as being the brother of Dayanidhi Maran, who was Union Minister for Communications and Information Technology in Delhi as a result of the DMK's strength in the 2004 Lok Sabha elections. That a rift between the Maran side of the family and the Karunanidhi side of the family was brewing was pretty well known. But the survey and the violent reprisals that ensued sparked a starker breakdown of party discipline, as factions that once operated behind doors now led to open attacks in newspapers and deaths on the streets of Madurai. Within a few days, Dayanidhi Maran was asked to step down from his post as union minister, even as he was being investigated for corruption in the telecom industry through a Malaysian cell phone company. This is an ongoing problem for the Maran family. Dayanidhi was replaced by A. Raja, and the rest is history. Meanwhile, under Kalanidhi Maran's ownership, the price of a single issue of the newspaper Dinakaran fell from 3 rupees to 1 because it was being supported by Sun TV, and the paper crept up to be the second most widely read Tamil daily in 2006. After the publicity provided by the Madurai attack, the paper has shed its connections to the Karunanidhi family and was able to project itself as a somewhat independent voice. By 2010, it had surpassed its rivals in sales to become the most widely read, one of the most widely read papers in India at the time. It was the 6th most widely read paper in 2010. So, Dinatandi remains a higher readership, but lower circulation. Dinakaran continues to prosper. Of course, the Maran family is in trouble, but we don't need to get into that. The next story I'd like to share is similar in some respects, but it concerns social actors who are very differently situated in the field of caste politics. In January of 2008, party cadres of the Dalit Vidudalai Sirutai Kalkachi, or Liberation Panther Party, BCK, attacked the offices of the 3rd largest Tamil paper, Dinamalar, on their Mount Road location in Chennai. They did so in response to an article critical of their leader, among the most important Dalit politicians in Tamil Nadu, Tol Tirumavalan. Around 20 men attacked the office. Once again, glass bottles, wooden logs were used. This time, 2 security guards suffered injuries. It appeared that some senior VCK officials called the office ahead of time to warn them that they might expect trouble for what they had published. But no policemen were there at the time. It's important to know that this is a paper that's run by a Brahmin family, and they have a reputation for provoking minorities and marginalized communities. The paper, of course, made much of the attack in its pages to further demonize Dalit politics. The news editor who decided to run the story is reported to have said, quote, "Recent incidents have proved that the VCK always resorts to violence instead of adopting democratic means to face criticism." Later that year, the paper would go on to publish the Danish cartoon depicting the Prophet Muhammad, originally published in Jyllands-Posten, leading to similar displays of popular anger at its office in Salem. As in the first attack, where Alagiri had to signal his strength to a Madurai DMK public at the expense of his less than stellar national image, here VCK activists had to protect the image of their leader, knowing that their image would be further defamed through upper caste media coverage of the event. And I think there's a sort of double consciousness on the part of a lot of these actors, that we know it's going to cost us at this level, but we know it's going to pay off at another level of representation. And this is an important part of the dynamic. Now, Dina Madara, as I said, has a reputation for this. In fact, it was threatened with a Charlie Hebdo-style attack the day after the Paris tragedy in a letter that had been circulated to the press. So my last example, it goes back to Nakiran. In 2012, the offices of Nakiran, the biweekly journal I discussed earlier, were ransacked by members of the ADMK party after it ran an article claiming that Jai Jayalalitha, current Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, eats beef, or cooked beef with MGR. It led, and the quote is kind of, because it's supposed to be a direct quote, Matakari sapram mami na, using, I'm a beef eating auntie, using the Brahminical dialects for mami, for auntie. This is at the time, Jayalalitha, she was rumored to be increasingly under the influence of Brahmin and Hindu nationalist advisors, chief among them Cho Ramaswamy, who publishes the conservative Tughlaq. Now this is a state where, of course, the non-Brahmin movement is very strong, and it was a cheeky poke in the form of a mock defense of her anti-Brahmin politics. Once again, a self-conscious choice taken by the editor, knowing that there were likely to be violent repercussions, and there were. Gopal would then be in the press saying, you know, the police have to protect me and so forth. Eventually, the following week, he had to publish an apology because the civil suit was still hanging over his head, and he was sort of bound to get prior approval for publishing such articles. Okay, so if we take the crowd as a medium, one that intermediates the news like the law, although without the latter's legitimacy in the realm of normative theory, I think we can begin to open up analyses along paths that are foreclosed in accounts that rely on a sharp distinction between legal rational structures and irrational crowd action. Now, many people sort of from here would go towards the argument that there's a violence inherent in the law, sort of following a trajectory from Benjamin and Derrida. I'd like to do something a bit different along 2 lines focusing on questions of mediation. The first line entails a rejection of the assumption that the crowd is either self-constituted through the pulsation of emotion or a mere instrument. This requires a corollary acknowledgement of the generative reciprocity involved in the constitution of mass-mediated political subjects. Political representation in the broad sense is a 2-way process in which the subject of democracy relies on the political representative for the very constitution of his or her identity. In the words of political theorist Susan Buck-Morss, the logical trick in this argument is that the collective of the people that supposedly constitutes democratic sovereignty does not exist until that sovereignty is constituted through forms of what she calls mass cathexis. And one image I like to use when thinking through this issue, this is Stalin, Karunanidhi's son and DMK leader, his face printed on an auto rickshaw windshield. And just to think about what it is to drive through the streets of Chennai every day looking through Stalin's face. So that's one end of it, but also other people see you through Stalin's face, and he is a form of protection, right? You're part of a club at that point. So the second sense of mediation that must be taken into account has to do with the fact that crowds taking to the streets, I've indicated this already, are already oriented as such to the fact of mass mediation as a constitutive part of their very action on the street. People are performing for media. They know they'll become material for the news in the cycle of news coverage and remediation that inevitably follows such performances. The crowd is subject to interpretive framings and, of course, legal action. In this sense, people on the street can represent both brute force as well as a much more fragile aspect of sovereignty, where force is a performance oriented toward, indeed subject to, and thus vulnerable before heterogeneous audiences. And this is part of the double consciousness I'm trying to get at. This raises, I think, interesting questions for how we might think about the role of political violence in the age of viral media, where being seen doing is often more important than being listened to. What these modalities of mediation, the law and body on the street, have in common is not only the way in which they're absorbed by news media, they also share a common concern with the reputation of the political leader. In the words of the Privileges Committee that had charged the Hindu and Murasoli with interfering with the very operation of the Legislative Assembly, they had done so by attempting to, quote, diminish the goodwill and fame that the government enjoys, end quote. This was, of course, about a person, not a government, but here we see where the personal envelops the state. And I think that the use of the words goodwill and fame are indicative of the type of reputation that's at stake and the forms of vulnerability that it's subject to. Here, instead of the forms of self-abstraction that characterize liberal publicity, where the public servant is essentially meant to be a bureaucrat executing the public's will through an office, we have one that's defined by an oscillation between everyday intimacies tied to the person of the leader and moments of representation in the stronger sense of standing for as proxy required of formal parliamentary democracy. This is a politics in which transparency is not the value by which the second form of representation is measured. That is, political representatives are not expected to simply represent and execute the already existing will of a people. And this is where they break the liberal contract. Fame, what we call pirumai, greatness, or puhar, renown, are perhaps more important values, and part of a logic through which people are made insofar as it's a mark of connection between a particular figure of personhood and a wider polity of appraisal and attachment. Through this approach, we can better appreciate collective investment in the concrete political image that's pointing back to an intangible sense of power that is that of the people in all their semiotic indeterminacy. Now I'll conclude with the argument that this is not some continuation of a logic of kingship, as is obvious, as it's often analyzed in culturalist terms, even if the vocabulary of popular sovereignty in South India and elsewhere often draws on tropes of royalty and, of course, even divinity. In case you were wondering, Amma is God. First of all, we're dealing here with a complex set of interdiscursivities where Republican notions of popular sovereignty, subaltern critiques of caste, mediated by numerical imaginations of community, are easily grafted onto discourses on just kingship that are now irrevocably tied to the question of economic development. But mine is not an argument about complexity per se. More importantly, the forms of hierarchical intimacy that connect leaders to their people are here radically reliant on modes of massification, circulation, and distance that contemporary media forms enable. This whole package is animated by the commodity image such that to the degree that leaders can sustain a sense of the virtual or spectral in the more aesthetic or expressive pole of their representative functions, acting as a fictive mother or big brother to the Tamil people, the auratic or ritual dimension of political leadership is sustained and even enhanced by technologies of image reproduction, including the newspaper and the photograph, with all due respect to Walter Benjamin. Indeed, the careers of both Karunanidhi and Jayalalitha, like Anna and MGR before them, substantially built themselves through media of cinema and newspapers, as well as oratory at the public rally. The political aesthetic they have cultivated, and what differentiated them from earlier generations of leaders that drew on a very Gandhian sort of anti-commodity ethos, is attuned to these very media that now make up much of the content of a digital infrastructure which has introduced new forms of contingency and vulnerability into the mix of image politics. I suspect that the recent spurt of defamation cases the government of Tamil Nadu is pursuing has much to do with a feeling of vertigo in the face of social media like WhatsApp, where the questions of publication, attribution of authorship are tricky and the means of dissemination uncontrollable, especially now that they've encrypted the whole thing. Who was responsible for the rumors about the Chief Minister's health circulating wildly through people's smartphones? Can you slap a case? You can slap a case on a registered publisher. You can attack a newsstand, but what can you do about your unauthorized image or rumors about your health that are being circulated through such media? Even blogs are very important. Savuka is an interesting blog. They've been trying to get after this guy for a long time, but it's tough to get after a blog using these legal means, or even the threats of force. The once protected form of oral rumor that long served the disenfranchised has been digitally reanimated and appears more potent and uncontrollable than ever. Cases of defamation, even sedition, the most recent one in Tamil Nadu being against Kovan, the folk singer, who, not because of his folk singing in the place where he was, but because it circulated wildly on the internet. Along with threats of violence that back them, appears grasping for straws in the era of decentralized circulation. We've entered an age where, if we follow recent analyses of finance capitalism, we might by extension argue that the discursive techniques of risk management around the propriety of the political image are giving way to a sense of sheer uncertainty and post-ideological affect. If the leaders of mass politics in Tamil Nadu and elsewhere are appearing more and more ghost-like, it's not only their physical age and illnesses that make it so. It has more to do with the logic of a shadow sovereignty over a territory the parameters of which, indeed the very qualities of which, are increasingly difficult to discern. The changing world of media that enabled the creation of the once novel political form of the celebrity mass leader with the power to transcend both state and cinema might well now sound its death knell. Just as the law struggles to keep pace with new networks of mediation that further fragment aspects of personhood, digital media's new power to shape the cinematic image opens new questions about the fate of the political and its relation to popular sovereignty in the democracy to come. That's it. So I assume we have some time for questions.
20 minutes. 20 minutes.
So, often in the news channels and television, this newspapers headlines gets a space in the news hour. Like, what are the headlines of across the newspapers?
Yeah.
And again, it gets discussed. The news channels, with increasing number of full news channels, like throughout the day, the newspaper headlines are reflecting, and it occupies the news. Across the scrolling news and the debates, and what is that? How does that? What have you seen that between the overlap between the news that is being printed and that is being reflected on the news channel? That's a recent thing that happened. What have you seen?
Yeah, that's a huge question that I'm interested in investigating further. Because often I tell people I'm looking at newspapers, and they go, "Why are you looking at newspapers?" Cable television is where everything happens. So there are two-way effects. Newspapers still maintain a great deal of legitimacy in the eyes of politicians and of course journalists themselves. So they set a certain tone of what the official story is. And among newspapers, The Hindu is the paper of record. Every single journalist, no matter what line of work they're in, reads The Hindu. And so it has a great deal of authority that is completely different from its actual readership. And so it does set a certain tone for what a certain standard of journalism is. At the same time, and it's often referred to in the TV media, at the same time, of course, newspapers are reacting to the new time frame that's been imposed, especially with the rise of 24/7 news that's offered by cable and now satellite television media, such that the forms of reporting that they're pursuing are more invested in the types of sound bites that appeal to that type of media consumption, as it were. And you see this especially in the field of legal reporting. And this is something I'm interested in looking more into, where offhand statements made by judges often become the stuff of the story. And I think digital media has, and television media especially, has really encouraged that dynamic that then feeds back into newspapers. And so there's a two-way, newspapers still serve as a sort of anchor of authority, but they are nevertheless profoundly affected by what's going on. And of course, now the future of newspapers is going to be on tablets and smartphones and so forth, and everyone knows that the so-called newspaper revolution that Robin Jeffrey had written about has plateaued, as it were, and is now we're going to see more integrated forms, which is why these newspapers are starting to open television stations of their own. And eventually, the assumption is the whole future will be web-based.
Hi, Frank. Thanks for the talk. I'm wondering, in your earlier work, there's been some unpacking of public spheres as they pan out in India. And in the anthropology of media, there's some consideration of what kind of a public sphere the internet is. But in this rumor kind of this anonymous stuff that you're talking about, that it occurs to me that that might completely flip over the public sphere debate altogether. We need to re-theorize public-private, I guess. What would you have to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, the public-private has been strained from the moment of sort of the debate on the public sphere as it sort of ensues. And of course, it's feminist critique that sort of really questions the value of the public-private divide that is so central to political theories of the public sphere. Now, of course, what's happening with the rise of social media and the sort of desire on the part of some to sort of massively publicize aspects of life that were once thought of as very intimate or closed off or so forth is further complicating that. So in a sense, yeah, we do completely need to rethink the public sphere. What I'm afraid of in some sort of recent formulations that have focused on this dynamic is the assumption that the old public sphere was something that we had already figured out. And it's only the new technological changes that require a sort of a rethinking of these. I think as often the case, you know, the proliferation of new technologies helps us understand old ones in new ways. So that's pretty much as I can say right now. I mean, WhatsApp, just in the last 2 or 3 years, has completely changed the face of journalism. This is how people get, you know, get stories. Then they go check it up with their usual sources and so forth. So it used to be a phone call, now it's WhatsApp, and of course that has a different sort of regime of circulation than phone calls. It is something that's increasingly difficult to control through the legal means available. And so lawyers are really scratching their head and legal theorists as to how we can try to regulate this thing. Now, of course, there's a sort of more libertarian utopian aspect of it, where people are happy that everything can apparently circulate endlessly now as some sort of newfound freedom. But of course, we've seen that with that freedom comes terrible repercussions. I mean, I'm thinking of the Muzaffarnagar riots and the use of an image from Afghanistan that then gets remediated as a means of provoking violence in a completely different place. So it's the sort of deterritorialization that was already there in sort of Apadrai's, you know, conception of globalization in the late 80s and early 90s now takes on a new form of immediacy, as it were, which is it's a difficult question.
The last part of your presentation, where you spoke of the possible ineffectiveness of the older forms of control, whether it's censorship or even defamation. Sedition could be another. In the light of newer media, now that question could have been asked even in the 1980s or the 70s when you know, older forms of censorship or when defamation began to be widely used, right? So, and as the rest of your argument seems to suggest, there is a whole performative dimension when the PP goes and files that defamation case. It's not, I mean, it's not as if the government is unaware of the, as you yourself pointed out, as the kind of publicity that you're giving this possibly obscure journalist,
yeah,
or a journalist who you know to be a member of or a sympathizer of the opposition and therefore will be supported or will rally around him or her a whole range of other players, which will in turn make the defamation case the object of a certain kind of campaign against the chief minister. So, I mean, for example, when people say, what good is the government of India's attempt to block 230 porn sites or, another set of sites which will also knock off, as it turns out, some news websites and so on. Now, unless you are crediting the government with an incredibly low intelligence, or not crediting, I mean actually accusing it of being extremely stupid, surely there's some other intention that we may not be getting. So you go back to defamation law, whose very constitutional validity is being questioned in the Supreme Court, and to do it 190 times is not perhaps because either the current government or the previous one, the DMK government which used it, is stupid, but precisely for the reasons that you are talking about. So in that sense, the new media does not pose a new problem. It's simply an area of risk. You can't do anything about it. So perhaps all the more reason why you have to go back to defamation law, which you know exactly how to use, and whose repercussions also you're pretty clear about.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the argument I'm sort of tending to at the end of the talk. And I tend to see spurts of uses of this defamation law, which is pure harassment, right? It's like these sedition cases, right? None of them are ever going to go beyond a certain level in the courts because these things are very tough to prove the criminality thereof. So it's an effective tool of harassment for the most part, and for the most part people don't feel compelled to report on it because it's going to lead to other, and it's also a signal that other threats are coming. And there's a story behind why the Hindu doesn't get as many defamation cases as they used to. But the argument is that with new media, and there's a spurt in the early 90s, and for me this has to do with the coming of satellite television, the rise of Sun TV, seems to promote outbreaks of defamation suits. And I think that we had a recent outbreak this last year. So it was kind of slow and steady we have now 5 years to look back on the last Jayalalitha regime. It was kind of slow and steady, and then last year it just spikes. And people were kind of waiting to see, is she going to do the same sort of great sovereign act of retracting all of these just before the election? She's not going to, I think. So the argument is it's a kind of vertigo that's, okay, these are the things that were at my disposal given the media world that I came up in. But now there's a whole new set of threats, and we don't have the legal means to, I mean, when we see things break out like the Jat riots in Haryana, you turn off the internet. That's the only thing you can do, which strikes many as utterly ridiculous response. The assumption that the government is not stupid, well, the government is a very multifaceted, I mean, the state, as we know, is made up of many players, some of whom are very stupid and some of whom are very savvy with regards to how media works. And even within the judiciary, there's a huge difference between judges who are very savvy about the fact that they are performing for media and judges who really have no idea of the fact that an offhand comment they're going to say becomes this huge story. So it's hard to generalize about the levels of calculation that go into attempts to either quell or produce a publicity. There's something relatively unstable about it, I think. And it's that instability, the vulnerability of the image is now, I think, becoming more manifest. I mean, and people try to tame it. So all these memes and so forth that are circulating, I mean, the Tamil Nadu elections are hilarious with the amount of comedy that it produces. But at the same time, they have now, this came out last week, apparently the ADMK has a relatively sophisticated IT task force that is now generating Facebook pages by the millions in order to generate positive publicity for their campaign. And so these, this is not the government, this is the party, right? So I think political parties are often much more savvy than bureaucrats who are going to survive whoever comes and goes.
I just have a slightly different question. Sorry, Chuck. Okay. What is the, I mean, if you were to look at the crowd as, again, shall we say, an instrument of governance, just as defamation law is, or the defamation cases, have you actually correlated the numbers? I mean, are there more crowd attacks at the time when there's a spurt in defamation, or that's more or less stable? Is there a spike? Is there a dip?
I can't find any strict correlation. There's also, I think, one has to come up with the typology of crowds, because there are all these one-off things, like Purya Talamurai was attacked by, what do they call themselves? The Hindu Ilanyar Sena, a one-man party. I mean, it's a group that comes up overnight, and we're seeing a lot of these, of course, as sort of fronts for the RSS trying to make inroads through caste politics in Tamil Nadu. Those are different types of crowds from, for example, when Kalaignar was arrested at midnight and the whole state went up, and I mean, that was a very different type of crowd. The political party crowds who are trained pretty much to do this are one type, but they're not the exclusive people who take to the street. So it's hard to, there's no strict correlation between defamation cases and crowds. But I do see some sort of correlation between the emergence or the new dominance of certain media forms and defamation cases.
Hi. So my question is, so you were saying that Hindu continues to have lots of readers and every journalist in the state continues to read the paper. So Hindu is generally considered to be slightly left-leaning, and also the editors are mostly upper caste, and the organization also seems to be mostly filled with upper caste editors and reporters. So why is it that it's continued to have a strong readership, although it's not too much, with publications such as Times of India and other coming in? So I'm just curious.
It's an interesting phenomenon. They're profoundly Brahminical, and they're a much disliked paper for that reason. And I think it tells you a little bit about the sort of ambivalences that sort of permeate a non-Brahmin dominated Tamil public sphere with regards to the questions of English education, Brahminical ideals, and so forth. You know, one of the things that you notice about the Hindu, if you look at its patterns of employment, is that they recruit a lot of very great young talent, and more people are cycling out more and more quickly because they find it to be a very difficult place to work if you're not part of the family and so forth. So the Hindu ethos then actually starts to permeate, or some of the better qualities of the Hindus start to then permeate a lot of other papers. For example, the Times of India China edition, half the staff are ex-Hindu people, because they have a lot more freedom working at the Times of India. They can say many more things. But for some reason, for me, it's becoming increasingly a mystery, as my opinion of the Hindu is going slowly down as I've been reading it for the last 20 years. But it is the gold standard. People point to its language, its use of English, actually, more than its cutting-edge news reporting, which no one would vouch for. The two things people point to, I'll tell you. The language and the center pages, the opinion pages of the Hindu, are what make the paper. They're able to get, and this is where they've started a Tamil edition. And once again, what people point to is the editor of the Tamil edition, Samas, has actually done a great job getting a lot of intellectuals into writing newspaper columns. So that's where the value of the Hindu is. It's in its language and it's in opinion-making capacities. That's what people look to, not so much its news reporting.
Frank, I have a boring question. How do you go about choosing your cases? And the second question is, do you have a typology of defamation cases? Are there types of defamations, some which live longer than others which die? They don't take off. There are so many attempts to defame. Mm-hmm. Some take off, some don't. And does that have something to say about the quality of political life in a community?
So, choosing my cases, I came upon the topic of defamation just talking to journalists, because it was one of the it's the thing that they're very concerned about as what limits what they can say. And then I quickly learned that no one had ever, that I've ever talked to has ever actually been, jailed for it. But they have to show up to court all the time. And so I realized that, okay, defamation is an interesting topic to look into. And the two cases that I've sort of presented here are kind of what I see to be extreme ends of the spectrum. By comparing the Hindu and Nakiran, who are often thought of as completely different worlds, you can see that something's been opened up by this field of defamation that has to do with the political image that they're reporting on. And so they have this strange commonality where Nakiran and Enram probably trade notes on how to fight a defamation suit. They probably don't have much else in common to talk about. So I thought that was an interesting thing to look at, and so I'm just looking at kind of two more extreme ends of defamation suits. There are millions of them, and often, so many of them very mundane. I mean, the Times of India one is kind of funny, that a report on road accidents should lead to a defamation suit. But it sort of shows you the extremely almost arbitrary nature of when they get applied and when they don't. But it's not arbitrary because it has to do with particular temporalities of feeling that you've lost control of your publicity. Different types of defamation suit. The main difference is that between criminal and civil. And so criminal defamation is this sort of low-level threat thing. It's really about someone's dignity as a journalist, right? Journalists like to think themselves above people, and this is about dragging you down into the criminal court in Chennai with everyone else who's been accused of a crime in the city that day. Civil defamation is an interesting field, and it's one that I'm looking into more now. It's used less by political leaders and more by corporates. It's actually a huge way in which, for example, Reliance really polices what you can say. I mean, the new editor of EPW, Paranjoy Guhatakota, has this huge case hanging over his head because he wrote a book about their dealings in a book called Gas Wars. About the politics of fuel in India. So there's a whole world of corporate control over media, and that is in the field of civil defamation suit because you need really deep pockets in order to get into one of these things. And it's a type of suit that tends to revolve more around the question of this intangible asset as a financial asset, right? It was interesting to look at when did Jayalalitha actually decide to get into a defamation suit, and it had to do with reporting on her relationship with Sasikula, essentially. That when that became sort of fertile ground for journalists, that's when it became personal in a way that allowed her to shift it into the civil realm, and she had accumulated enough capital for it to be worth her while. So those are the two kinds of defamation suits. But as I said, defamation is actually a broad concept that can be used, many laws, there are many instruments at people's disposal to accuse someone of defamation. So for example, these anti-scurrilous writing acts were in fact modifications of the provision in the IPC which has to do with obscenity and indecent writing. But they enlarge it so much that it becomes about reputation more generally, and it becomes a defamation charge essentially. Breach of privilege, contempt of court, these are all different ways in which issues that we could call defamation are brought into play by specific legal mechanisms, and each has its own logic. Criminal defamation is favored because it's so easy to slap on someone. It is essentially a cognizable offense, even though it is bailable. So you have to keep showing up to court, but you'll never get convicted. Thank you very much for allowing me to share this work with you, because it's really in progress.
Next class meets here.
Oh, okay.